Hello teacups, what's brewing? Again, it's been a while. I get sick of apologizing and I'm sure you get sick of hearing it, but when I say work was difficult this week, we had a lot of deadlines for right at the end of the week that I was working on, and while I had foodie stuff kind of playing in the background, the kind of time it takes to kind of sit, make notes, get clips, put it all together, film, then edit it down just wasn't viable for me this week, I'm afraid. And Foodie herself has been fairly busy. She's been doing the most, especially around the end of last month. We did at one point have like a couples video, a mukbang, and a live go out all within slightly less than 24-hour period. Now that was because I believe it was the last day of April. And I'm guessing all she was trying to do, the YouTube paycheck tends to ratify your final amount on the 1st of May. It like calculates it and right at the end of the month, and then it says anything you earn after this point will go on to your next paycheck. So anything she earned in April, she gets paid between the 21st and the 25th or 6th of May. So anything she could just push out there before anything else happened, she'll get paid for this month. Whereas anything ratified in her next paycheck, she won't receive until June. So we saw this sudden outflow of videos in the hopes that she could pull the money together at that time. I do have notes here, which is why I'm moving forward and looking down. She really seems to be leaning into doing anything possible to try and rebuild her audience. We can see that with not only her regular return to mukbangs, but also in her attempt to try and like build up drama again between her and the reactors, like it ever really went away. But she did have a point when she was like, oh no, a point, many times at which she was like, no, I want a different kind of channel, I don't want it to be so drama filled, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna rise above it. And we've had very quiet periods where she's realized that her Kuwait content that's pre-recorded doesn't exactly hold the attention, and now we're back to this. So she attacked Just Brazen in her community post for using the money she earned on YouTube to do nice things with her daughter. She uploaded a post attempting to parody garlic bread, and then uploaded a terrible attempt at a music track, and now a live talking about nada. So really just scraping the bottom of that barrel to try and find anything she can. Unfortunately for her at the moment, the views aren't really reflecting this change in the way I think she probably would want it to, but it doesn't really need to in a sense, and there's a few things it is doing that will be helpful. Number one, it requires absolutely no effort on her part to turn on the camera while she's eating. So she doesn't have to think of places to go, she doesn't have to be out in the heat, which we'll talk about in a sec. She doesn't have to think of content or find places or a sala. Like, there's no effort involved in her switching on the camera and eating her dinner. Also, because it means any meal can be a mukbang, she can put them out as quickly as she wants to, really. They're things that she can be very consistent with because eating is something she actually wants to do. And when anything can be content, you've got a lot of content you can exploit. So even if her views are lower, she is going to see some benefit from that. The other thing it's doing in a business sense is it's giving her channel a theme again that isn't just mess, and so that means from a YouTube perspective, if they can tell what her channel is about, they know what advertising to put on it. Now, we would have arguments over what suitability her channel has for ads, but in terms of her content now being food themed, that makes it a lot easier for advertisers to draw a correlation, which means she's probably going to start getting paid a little bit more for ads, and she's probably going to be able to be pushed out by the algorithm a bit more because they know how and where and when to recommend it. Now, Foodie does a lot to hamstring her own business. In terms of how she deletes, in terms of her rages, and like I said, the conversation of if she should be advertising at all is one that people are more than happy to have, but in terms of the algorithm, it makes her channel simpler to deal with, which is usually going to be to her benefit. Now, as I say, mukbangs are something she can do inside. She is becoming more and more limited by the heat, which we suspected would happen because we didn't think the heat was going to be easy for her to deal with. It's definitely not for anybody, really. But I'm surprised how early it's hitting her. Because Canada gets fairly hot in the summer, right? It gets into the 30s. She's currently around mid-30s. I know Kuwait runs a degree or two hotter than Oman, usually on average. But right now we're getting temperatures of like 32, 33 with a real feel of like 35. So when the proper summer hits, you can easily expect 10 degrees above that. Go 43 to 45 would be what I would expect. She keeps saying 50 to 60, and as I said before, I wouldn't expect that, certainly not 60. I've had warnings when I lived in Saudi once that it might hit 50 and we should be careful, but it's not a regular occurrence. Nevertheless, there is a probability that it's going to get even hotter, and she already is like KO'd by it. She's just not going outside right now when she can help it, and has indeed said she intends just to stay inside. Now, in her attempt to drum up some views and drama, she decided she was going to talk about Nada this time around, and she was saying how she wasn't going to be a witness for him. I can't imagine him wanting her as a witness. I think she'd be a detriment to the case as a whole, on either side. But she did bring up this point about Dee Dee, and I want to just insert it here.
She looks like the life has been sucked out of her. Yeah, what I find funny about her is how she's so vehement towards me, how she hates me so bad and blames me for ruining her life. Now look at the meth addict in your apartment, burning your kitchen down. That's who ruined your life. And you inserted yourself and ruined your own life. Okay, thank you.
Now, before we get into the thing that this actually triggered for me in my brain, vehement. I know it's petty, you guys, but vehement. Yes, okay. Is that the super secret squirrel way of pronouncing it that we can't Google, but you're definitely right about? But moving on, the thought this brought up, she brought up Dee Dee, and she was laughing at Dee Dee, and she was talking about how she didn't understand Dee Dee at all. And it made me remember when Dee Dee first came onto the scene, and even to this day, nobody could really understand her motivations. And she's been the hardest to read of many of the side characters. And it just made me think, is Salah really kind of the new Dee Dee at this point? Because I would have expected, based on how things have gone, that he would have dropped her already. Because the truth of her personal situation and her financial situation means some of the more obvious scams that he could have been running really wouldn't be possible. So if he's truly in this for the longer haul, his motivations are mysterious. I still don't trust him as far as I can throw him, but I don't think I quite get his angle, much as I felt with Dee Dee at the time. She's been making the point about FFG because of course she wants to bring this up again with the conversation of bringing Sam to Kuwait. Now it seems closed now that she's realised that it might be like hard and stuff. But she says there's no proof that BBJ is fine. We've seen a close-up with her with a Gucci collar. And I would say FFG did release some paperworks. And to be honest, whatever you think of FFG, she does seem to have had a history of caring for pets. You know, so I don't think there's anything untoward there. However, I feel about how BBJ was removed, I think her life is probably better for it now. But I do find it interesting that no, we need to show proof. But if we show proof, it's definitely wrong, even though she can't prove it in return. But speaking of proof, as I'm sure you're not surprised, given the history of my channel, it does lead me into my next topic, which is that Chantal has been mentioning more and more recently that she is a resident. She has been asserting that, even though some of the other things she's been saying seem to run counter to that statement. She is really insistent that she has disproved everything that I said before and that anyone has said about her status, despite the fact that I have seen no explanation, no picture, no document, no community post, no video, or any other form of media or anything that would seem to have done so. I do, however, think 1000% that this is a solid attempt to gaslight everybody, where if she says often enough that she proved me wrong, and if she says often enough that no, she is a resident, then with the way the community works and the way people come in waves and they ebb and flow in and out of the community, that eventually the idea that that is truth will enter the community vernacular and be true by sheer reputation and force of will. But as I don't tend to come to things without receipts, let's look at the clips.
I do still pay my taxes. The ones I owe, like I pay them in installments, so that's being taken care of. It's not like I moved here to avoid paying taxes, but when I do become a resident here, I won't have to pay taxes. Like, it'll give me a good break for...
Hopefully I've gone in and dated these so you can see the timeline, but this was March 10th, and she was saying about how when I become a resident. So this was the second time she entered Kuwait, which means she wasn't a resident yet. So she must have come in on a tourist visa, even ignoring all of the other stuff that we have said before in terms of timelines and things like that. She's saying when I become. So at that point on the 10th of March, she wasn't. Bear in mind that when you become a resident, there is a time limit on applying for things like your civil ID. Now, I believe she was asserting at that point that she was going through the application process of it. And so I'm pretty sure her health scare that she had with her breathing was somewhere around this time, and she had mentioned that she paid and showed her passport at that clinic instead of the civil ID because the civil ID hadn't arrived yet. It takes about 10 working days to go through. So we're going to go forward in time a little bit.
You can actually be, like Salah can sponsor me here, so. And it's not on a family visa like everybody thinks. It's not that.
So her claim that she's not on a family visa is actually entirely reasonable because a family visa isn't going to be that different from a tourist visa. It just means you've been invited in by someone you're related to instead of essentially inviting yourself with the tourist visa. And it has very slightly different requirements about where you're living and stuff like that. But a family visa wouldn't gain her anything. She wouldn't have any rights that she didn't have before. But do point out that she said he can sponsor her as presumably her husband, even though I still have my doubts, rather than has sponsored her. Now, she may be confusing the name family visa with dependence visa, which is when you do get sponsored as a wife or as an offspring of somebody who is resident. But again, they would need to have a non-temporary marriage for that, which I am not convinced in any way, shape or form she has.
Have you gotten a physical? Not really, Hannah. Medical support. Yeah, I have health insurance, yeah. But, yeah, so, like, whenever, like, before becoming a resident here, you have the OHIP, which covers international claims. But when I went to the clinic, it was so cheap that I didn't even need to make a claim. But as a resident, you get coverage here as well.
Now, I've gone through before that part of the residency process is getting a medical. I had one a few days after I arrived here. Now, I've gone over before some of the more important tests you need to do to be accepted as a resident, things like Hep B, Hep C, syphilis, a pregnancy test for women. I know that Chantal can't get pregnant, but she still needs to prove that she's not. However, something really simple that I don't think I necessarily went into is in the Kuwaiti ID card that you get, it stores certain information for emergency situations. So if support services are there trying to help you and you're unconscious on the floor, your ID card contains things like your blood type, like any allergies and any major medical conditions you might have. So something simple like a blood type certificate has to be provided when you apply for your civil ID because that information goes in. And that's part of the reason you need to have the medical. Because that means if doctors are trying to treat you and they can't communicate with you to get that information, they can go look it up on your record. Also, she talks here about how as a resident, she gets coverage in Kuwait. And you can get coverage, but as a resident in Kuwait, you have to pay to access the cover. And it's actually a big point of contention in Kuwait right now that they feel that the foreign contingent living in Kuwait is taking away from the effectiveness of the services. And so Kuwaiti people are getting prioritized. They're looking at not allowing foreigners in at certain times. And it's quite a big issue right now. But more than anything, I get the impression here that she's saying these things because she's read them rather than experienced them. Because these little missteps, you wouldn't make them if you have the lived experience, because you'd remember going through it. You'd remember having to go and pay that bill to get your coverage. You wouldn't mistake it because you've done it. Whereas if you read something and you accidentally misspeak or you have passed it in a slightly different way, it sticks out as sounding strange because you don't have the lived experience to back it up. Someone who had gone through this wouldn't make these mistakes. And the only example we have of her being in a medical situation, she used her passport and she paid. Now, you could, and I'm sure she would, argue that it was just too early in the process and it wasn't worth the effort of going through the other system, and okay, we'll keep saying that. But all of this is adding up. Now, I included the next clip because, man, she's not a very good liar for someone who does it so often.
Yeah, Molly, I don't have to, worry about the leaving the country right now, so, mashallah.
Immediately, her voice went quiet and kind of trailed down. She looked down and off to the side. No, I don't have to worry about it right now. Yeah, but at the end of the month you might need to, because that's when your tourist visa is due to be up. There is actually another clip that I think I forgot to include where someone mentioned her tourist visa was up in one of these lives, and she was like, "You're keeping track of my tourist," and then she sort of stopped herself because she didn't want to talk about the fact that she was on a tourist visa. And unsurprisingly, we then have this clip.
Can we see your civil ID? No. I never showed you my driver's license in Canada or my passport. Why would I show you a civil ID? You know? Same thing with the marriage license. I don't think we should show it to people, you know? Let people think it's a scam marriage. Let people think Salah's a scammer. We really don't care anymore. You actually did show us your passport. Did I? Because we're asking.
So as I said before, we should all prove what we're saying, which I feel I do prove what I'm saying, but you won't because you can't, but it's personal, you guys. And when we do, of course we're wrong because you say so, even if we take out the documents, because quite frankly, the one thing I think she's right on is if she were to show anything right now, I would not believe it were real. I just wouldn't, because I don't believe that it could be based on everything else I've told you. It wouldn't make sense. But she won't even describe the procedure she went through. For example, she tried to prove that she was fully, legitimately, legally married. And by legally, I mean with a full marriage that could have been used for visa processes, not the temporary contracts. And she tried to prove that by showing us the courthouse, yeah? And when she's described the procedure of the courthouse, she's been vague because she's just kind of bad with details and doesn't understand much. But some of the details she's given have been fairly consistent. So I believe she went to a courthouse. I believe she signed a temporary marriage, and that bit of paper they had was confirming that. I don't believe they've been able to convert it into essentially a better type of marriage, one that's more useful to them because of all the other reasons we've discussed since then. She won't even describe the process of becoming a resident because she hasn't gone through it, or even something close to it. But don't worry, Chantal is not concerned because apparently the law in Kuwait is very flexible with these things.
Who's still talking about the fake marriage? Hilarious stuff I've ever heard. Yeah. It's because people go off of Google, they go off of Google, it says on Google that, yeah, you can't get married on a visitor visa. You go by what the law states. Well, I'm telling you, there's ways around it. There's different laws, I guess, that are not online. I don't know.
My question here is, I've got a couple of issues with this as an idea. No, the law can be getting around. Oh, really? International woman of mystery. Oh, really? Let me ask you if you think this makes sense, right? So you've got an immigration service. Now, immigration tends to be one of the more clearly stated branches of the government, precisely because it's relevant to foreigners. They tell you what to do because you have to do it to come into the country. And most of the people who want to come into the country don't live in the country full time. So this particular branch of what the government does is as documented as things tend to get in government. But even if, because one thing I do try to be on this channel is fair, and I will say that sometimes the Middle East is not great at updating their stuff. So even if there were a way that perhaps hadn't made it onto a website or hadn't made it into an official document, or maybe just was available in Arabic and hadn't been translated into English, even if that existed somewhere, do you seriously think the way the internet works, do you seriously think that means it wouldn't be available somewhere online from a non-official source? Because I tell you now, whatever you may think about Kuwait and living in Kuwait, there are worse places in the world to live. And do you seriously believe if there were a way that you could bypass the regular way to get married and become resident in that country, that it wouldn't be on every expat forum, every Facebook group, any source of information that people who were desperate to leave their own lives in their own countries by any means necessary, you think that they wouldn't be accessing that information and there wouldn't be step-by-step guides to help these communities of people? That is not the way the internet works. Loopholes like that do not stay private. But as we all know, Foodie does have a very strong reputation in terms of being able to verify what she says. So with that in mind, she has a very important message that I think you should all hear.
You should watch Milkteareacts. No, she's not actually accurate at all whatsoever. She did this huge expose on our fake marriage, which was none of it was true at all, because we're married, and so you were wrong. You know what I mean? How is that accurate? Not whatsoever.
And to which I say, evidence to the contrary, my dear. I never did an expose on Foodie. I showed the law, I showed the evidence for the law, I drew on my own personal experience of being in this area and dealing with the law, and I said, hey, Foodie's doesn't seem to match. If that exposed her, then that is a problem with the things she's telling us, not with the law, and certainly not with my interpretation of it. However, if Foodie would like to bring some evidence to the table here, then I would actually, without sarcasm, actually be genuinely happy to look at it. When it comes down to it, the Occam's razor of this all is that she is most likely lying. And I've seen no evidence or story that's been particularly compelling to convince me otherwise. But what I think Foodie doesn't realize is that I and many people would be actually open to seeing that evidence. I realize that a lot of people are like, it doesn't matter what she does, she will be wrong. But if Foodie could tell us something reasonable, if Foodie could show me something reasonable, I would be willing to look at it. I'd be willing to reconsider. But she hasn't shown anything, and she's been massively evasive at every turn when she had the opportunity to do so. And with that in mind, I see absolutely no reason to change my mind or to change my stance on what's going on here. So with that, she is going to have to leave the country for her tourist visa. Recently, the conversation changed from flying, which she doesn't like to do and is uncomfortable and can't really do by herself with the distance it is, because there was talk of her maybe going and getting Sam, and now she's changed her mind. But she could definitely drive over the border to Saudi and go into Riyadh and try and apply for a visa there. So I think that's likely what they'll do. If she really wanted to avoid flying, that is. She could fly into Qatar or Bahrain or anywhere quite simply, reasonably cheaply, and it would take less time, but she'd probably be more comfortable in a car where she could take frequent breaks. And we'll have to see moving forward if we have any suspiciously quiet times in her channel, or if she ends up using a trip to Saudi, which she's already been talking about, as content. In some ways, her channel feels like it's going back in time, so we may not see anything at all. She might just be like, no, I'm doing mukbangs now. But I don't think, even with how hard she's trying to replicate her old content, that she's going to replicate even a fraction of her old earnings with it. And I think she's accepted that as well. But if she can get to the point where it's close enough to support her, I think she'll keep going. Okay, everyone, and that's basically all I have for you today. So I hope you're doing well. Thank you for your patience, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.